Mais bon. Bon, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation et l'introduction. Et je suis très heureux d'être ici parce que, avec vous, de fêter ou de commémorer le 15e anniversaire de votre réseau et de votre institution. Chez nous, c'est beaucoup plus difficile parce qu'on a une histoire qui est assez longue, mais en même temps, c'est toujours un peu souterrain et toujours un peu difficile. Si on discute de la sociologie, au département d'architecture à Zurich, à l'EPFL. Ça commence dans les années 60 avec Lucius Burckhardt, qui était assez célèbre à l'époque, qui était très très important, aussi pour les architectes. Si on prend Herzog de Meuron, eux, il se souvient toujours parce qu'il était des disciples de Lucius Burckhardt et pour eux c'était une expérience très très importante. Mais en même temps, on a chassé, on n'a pas donné un chair stable, un chair ordinaire, ce que nous appelons un chair ordinaire à Burckhardt. Et il a quitté l'EPF7. On avait toujours un peu de sociologie et on a encore un peu de sociologie, mais ce n'est pas une institution stable, c'est toujours un peu précaire. Et l'histoire que je vais raconter maintenant, c'est une histoire qui commence presque 20 ans, presque il y a 20 ans, parce que c'est vraiment le moment de la naissance de l'ETH Studio Bâle, qui était le moment où, je pense, une nouvelle chapitre de la collaboration entre les sciences sociales et l'architecture a commencé. And now I change into English. Mon français est un peu rouillé. J'ai besoin de plus de pratique pour faire un discours d'une demi-heure. So now I change in English, that makes it easier for me, and maybe also for you. Okay, now I just jump into the topic and I will come back to this question of the cooperation of social sciences and architecture, because, and you will see that there is a different kind of conception behind that, because I wouldn't call that what you are doing a kind of interdisciplinary research. I would call that a transdisciplinary research, which is in many respects quite different, because we try to work together and to have a kind of, let's say, convergence of perspectives and of our work. And you will see how that unfolds during the talk. So I just jump now into this debate about planetary urbanization, which of course comes from the French, which is urbanisation planétaire, and le planétaire, and that's actually the last text that Henri Lefebvre published, and it was a short text he published in Le Monde Diplomatique, and there he explains this kind of question of the urbanization in an age, in a planetary age. By the way, just as a detail, the idea of le planétaire you find already in earlier works of Henri Lefebvre, you find it already in La Révolution urbaine, you find it already in La production de l'espace, but it was only as small traces. But the idea was already present. So this idea of the planetary is not a kind of totalitarian and abstract concept that is this kind of whose use would be to somehow subjugate all kind of urban studies under this concept. That's not at all the idea of it. The idea is the opposite. The idea is that it's an observation that certain processes develop a kind of planetary reach, and the planetary perspective is necessary to grasp them. Okay, so I will try to go through that and to give at the same time a kind of some hints of how we applied this kind of combination and cooperation between architecture and social sciences. Now, as I told already, so the concept of planetary urbanization comes from Henri Lefebvre. It had a kind of a revival, and it was, there were not many people who started with that concept in the early 1910s. It was Andy Murrayfield. He published some texts with that concept, and then it was especially Neil Brenner and I who at a certain moment have chosen to use that term because we found it especially useful to address certain tendencies that we see today. And I will unfold kind of our observations, but the basic idea of planetary urbanization is that we say there is a planetary reach of urbanization processes in the sense of that the urban and urbanization doesn't stop anymore at some borders. There are no borders anymore on the world. You could put it the other way around and you could say every place of that planet is in one way or another kind of influenced or marked by processes of urbanization. So you can place yourself on every part of that planet and you can somehow detect certain traces and certain processes of urbanization. So that's the basic idea behind that. It's not a top-down perspective, it's a bottom-up perspective, but it has to be understood that if you look on those processes, of course, you have to take a planetary perspective. But the planetary perspective is not the idea that you take a satellite and then you look down to Earth. It's the other way around. The idea is, what you need is a kind of decentering of the analytical perspective. So you go outside of what we call cities, you somehow decenter yourself. Usually if we make urban studies, and I mean very classically, if you take the definition of the agglomeration, usually you stand at the very center of a place, of a so-called city, and then you look outwards, how far reaches this city? And our proposal is to make it completely different. And for us, this is not a really relevant question anymore. So we would place ourselves somewhere outside and look how urbanization approaches us. So it's a decentering of the perspective. And this decentering of the perspective has a lot to do with the post-colonial turn. I see this kind of processes or these kind of perspectives are strongly linked. And to be honest, my researchers, they see themselves that together with me kind of work on planetary urbanization, they would most of them call themselves actually post-colonial researchers. So it is not only a perspective that is kind of linked, but it is also a perspective that somehow almost by necessity has kind of overlaps. And I mean, the point of the starting point of the post-colonial turn was, as everybody knows here, the critique of the dominance of Western concepts, especially transatlantic concepts or kind of North Atlantic concepts, as you want to describe it. And I just take now one call or one title of a book that in that respect is especially useful, which is Jennifer Robinson's book Ordinary Cities, and which just says, okay, we shouldn't always go back to Chicago or Berlin or London or Paris. We should take every city as a possible starting point for urban research and theory building. And that was, of course, based on manifold experiences that Jennifer Robinson made in South Africa, or Ananya Roy made in Kolkata, doing her research there, doing her PhD there, and then she said, okay, what kind of concepts could I use? And her teachers in Berkeley said, yeah, this is all a kind of deviation. This is so the normal model is somehow how Western cities develop, and we don't have really a concept of how other cities develop. And the point is to say, okay, these are not other cities and these are not exceptions, but these are ordinary cases, but they are just different. And so every city could become a place and should become a place of theory building or a starting point of theory building. And I couldn't support that more, but I would even go one step further and say not only every city can become and should become a place of theory building, but every place on that planet could become a starting point of theory building. Now, the concept, in the meantime, is widely debated in very controversial ways. I will not go into the details of that controversy, and especially not on all the critiques that came, because these critiques came from all sides. I just go to the core of what Neil Brenner and I tried to do. And so we had a kind of idea that this phenomenon of planetary urbanization implies a kind of, has some important epistemological implications. And we just brought it down to seven points, which is completely random. It could be 9 points or 5 points. We just had 7. And if you look at this, I think it's not a kind of universalizing kind of approach, but it's just a kind of proposal how we could try to find maybe a certain convergence in our analysis of urban processes. And much of these points are, of course, developed by other peoples and applied by other people since a long time. So that's not at all new. It is more a kind of an idea so that we could maybe have a kind of common understanding how to approach and analyze urbanization. And now I have to make a small, in brackets, a small remark. So we didn't propose a concept on planetary urbanism, because urbanism for us is something very different. Urbanism, planetary urbanism, might be a concept that you think you should address the entire world and they should follow a certain concept. So we don't talk about planetary urbanism. We never use that term. What we mean is planetary urbanization. Now, the starting point is it is a theoretical category, and there are quite different theories on urbanization and the urban as well, of course. So we won't have agreement on that, because if you go through, and I don't do that now, but if you go through all the definitions, we would find all sorts of definitions, what the urban is, what urbanization is. There is no common agreement, neither in social science, nor in architecture, nor in urban design. Second point, but there should be a certain agreement, and this is at least our conviction and our proposal, that we treat the urban and urbanization as a process. And I think it's quite clear to somehow understand why, because we see that our places that we call cities, how they change. I mean, they change so fast that we can even see it, okay? If we make research today and we go to certain places, to, let's say you go to Cairo or you go to Kolkata, and then you go 3-4 years later, and this might be a totally different city. So we see it. We can even see it, how these changes are going on. In other places, maybe slower, but and so the urban is constantly moving, is constantly developing, and to try to understand the kind of universal urban that is the same since the, let's say, the old Greeks and the old Romans up to today, that is, from our point of view, a quite hopeless kind of trial to find a universal definition of the urban that you can apply in all situations and all times. Then we looked on this urbanization process, and I will come back to that in a minute, and we made a new kind of approach or a new distinction, and we said there is not only concentration. Urbanization does not only mean concentration as the term agglomeration suggests, but it also somehow entails processes of extension. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then next point is also urbanization. We should look at urbanization as something multidimensional. So very often urbanization is just seen as monodimensional in the sense of, let's say, classic definition, growth of cities. So the only dimension you have is the number of people that live in this area that you call an agglomeration, and if that is growing, then you call that urbanization. So we would say that's not enough. Urbanization is multidimensional, has many aspects. I come also back to that in a minute. Urbanization has become planetary, and again, this is something that we would place in space and time. So the idea is not that urbanization was always planetary. I won't have time to explain that in detail, but in our analysis, we would say that is something that happened in the last 20 or 30 years. So it's a recent phenomenon that urbanization has become planetary. Next one is, and that's a very important one, and many people think planetary urbanization means everything becomes the same, and we don't agree at all with that kind of idea. Our understanding is that planetary urbanization implies even an increase, in many respects, an increase of differences in the urbanization process. So there are variegated patterns, many variegated patterns and pathways of urbanization. And that's also a topic that I can't address now in details. We made even a book on that at ETH Studio Basel with the title Specificities. Why cities necessarily become specific, and it's an explanation how we define specificity and what does that mean. And that it does not mean that you can't discuss about different places or you can't compare different places, but it means that you have a certain understanding of the factors that make every urban space specific at a certain moment in time. And then finally, the urban is always a common project. So the urban is a social fact, is a social process, but it's at the end, if the urban should really work and develop its kind of capacities, let's say the power of the urban as a social process means that people do something together, and they somehow, in a maybe very maybe undefined way even, but they nevertheless do something together, and we could understand the urban as a common project. Yeah, so one way to address that is, of course, this idea of implosion, explosion. This means concentrated and extended urbanization. That was a starting point of our reflections. Neil Brenner published that book with that title, Towards a Study of Planetary Urbanization, and put together, it's a massive volume that brings together all sorts of texts that were already published or some are also new or were new at the time of the publication, that somehow bring a kind of some ideas together that people, different researchers from different places also had already some difficulties with the understanding of, let's say, the city as a bounded unit, as a territorial unit, and found some irritations in the real processes that they analyzed and tried to cope with these experiences. So a kind of a starting point for us for our further reflections. Now, behind that, of course, is always Henri Lefebvre looming around the corner, and of course his thesis of complete urbanization of societies, or of society, and I don't go into the detail. I mean, his analysis of urbanization and especially his three-dimensional theory of the production of space produced considerable troubles in understanding, but I would say very productive troubles. And one book that addresses these kind of questions, and that's already, I just show it because I show it as also a product that we did in Zurich that also manifests the, let's say, co-production or cooperation between social sciences and architecture. So Henri Lefebvre in social research and architecture that we did together with Lukáš Stanek and Ákos Moravanský. Ákos Moravanský was a professor in Zurich. Lukáš Stanek was a student in Zurich for at least a certain time. and now that's gone. Now it comes back. And this is a book where we really try to address these kind of questions from a perspective that brings together, let's say, architectural perspective perspectives and concerns, and social science perspectives, and especially also social science methods. Now, so what does it mean if we talk about urbanization? I said it is from our point of view, we look at it as a multidimensional process. Now, you can define that process in many different ways. So we just have a proposal here, which is, of course, strongly oriented on Henri Lefebvre's three-dimensional concept of the production of space, but just applied on urbanization processes. So urbanization is, let's say, just start with the evident. Urbanization is a material production process, and it is based on spatial practices. So if we, and that includes more or less everything that we could imagine with that. So already moving in space is a social practice, and somehow if we cross a lawn always on the same time, always on the same space, on the same place, then a certain pathway emerges, and that could also already be seen as a way of producing space. And if we occupy a square, or if we meet on certain places, this is also space production. But of course, it can also be the production of space. Material production of space can also be very heavy, of course, with heavy infrastructure, with all sorts of buildings, and so embraces, of course, the production of the built environment. Now, that's not all of it, because urbanization, of course, also is related with the production of knowledge. I can't go into the details here. I mean, it also means production of images. It means production of concepts, and that means the social production of concepts. Of course, what architects are doing, what social scientists are doing, if we are kind of drawing, producing maps, developing concepts, that's all part of the production of knowledge. And that then turns into also something that we call the territorial regulation. So regulations that somehow tell us how we have to behave in space, how we have to produce space, from, let's say, all sorts of let's say, guidelines, how you have to use public space, up to very elaborated planning documents. And then finally, urbanization always means also the production of meaning. Of course, the term of lived space enters here, the debate, and of course, everyday life. So it is something that we have to always to root into everyday life. I mean, it's anyway rooted in everyday life. It's only the question whether we really look at it or if we just kind of negate it. So here the proposal is we should look at these three dimensions. We could have others. So this is just, of course, following Lefebvre's, you know it, perceived space, conceived space, and lived space. Now, what for us is now a key point, and that's not from Lefebvre, but it is somehow inspired by Lefebvre, something that we really started to think about when we also went into the economic theories of agglomeration, not just in the demographic kind of concepts, how to measure an agglomeration, but all this, so the question of the power of agglomeration, so these economic theories, we realized that they are somehow one-sided. The point is, you can't have concentration. You can't have concentrated urbanization without extended urbanization, and that's very simple. If you concentrate people, let's say means of productions, capital, buildings, goods. If you concentrate all that, I mean, you have to feed the people. First of all, the people comes from somewhere, so they come from. So this is immigration. And that means that this creates a link to the places where people come from. Then people need food, people need water. These kind of places need all sorts of raw materials. And all these things are produced somewhere and are linked to the cities. And that means that somewhere, these places somewhere that usually are placed in the outside, so this was the point with the outside. An urban theory without an outside does not mean that nothing is outside of the urban. That was not at all the idea. But the point is that very often we place kind of processes that are directly linked with the urban outside of the urban. So agrarian production that feeds the population of cities or of urban regions, we have to include somehow in these urbanization processes because they are linked, they produce for these places, and we have to follow these links and we have to follow the effects that it has on these places. We then even added a third term, differential urbanization, but that's not too much for the moment. I just go forward and so the usual way how we look at cities, or how, not we look at cities, but the usual way how, let's say, mainstream urban studies look at cities, let's put it this way, is, well, just they look on agglomerations, they look on urban regions, they look on megacities, and the typical representation of that would be this. So these are the 500 biggest urban regions in the world. They have all more than 1 million inhabitants. Well, they used to be that. This is the map from, I think, 2010 or something. So that changed already. But the point is, you have these bubbles here, and the bigger the bubble, the bigger the so-called city. And this is one possible representation, and that's the urban. And all that is not red is the outside. So that's a classic understanding of the urban. Now, extended urbanization means, just very simply, no urban agglomeration can exist without extended forms of urbanization. And just to illustrate that, so that's also a form of urbanization, and these are the global shipping lanes. So all these container boats that ship, that are traveling the oceans, and building a kind of almost very high density places, especially around here. This is Singapore, and the Singapore Straits as the most congested kind of motorway for ocean liners. And that's also urbanization. We can't say this is outside, this is in the oceans. And if you go and along these shipping routes, you'll find, of course, all sorts of elements of the urban, like huge plastic islands. Some of them are bigger than Greenland, kind of circling around in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now the question is, how can we analyze these extended forms of urbanization? And now I come back to what started almost 20 years ago in 1999 at ETH Studio Basel. So four architects, so Jacques Herzog, Pierre Demeron, Marcel Meili, and Roger Diener, they somehow, it would be another story, they opened this kind of Studio Basel. They said, we want to make a project, we want to analyze Switzerland. So, and they had a title. They said, we want to make an urban portrait of Switzerland. But this was the only thing they had not the slightest idea how they could do that. And they had also no methods and no theory about that. I was invited at the very beginning to join that group, and I did that with great pleasure. And I still remember our first meeting where we discussed what to do was actually when the course started. And it was like this kind of 68 kind of happenings. So you can imagine you have a room like that and you have 20 students, and they know they will now go to a studio of these famous architects. And we sat here and we discussed, how shall we start today? And we discussed for at least half an hour, and then we came to a certain conclusion, and then I still remember Jacques Herzog said, okay, well, let's start. Hello, good morning, this is now what we are doing. And they were already sitting since half an hour and watching what we are discussing. So you could say that was a real research project, because we had a question, but we had no answers, and we had no methods, and we had no theories. So we developed everything somehow from scratch. And of course, we used the things that were available. For instance, Henri Lefebvre's theory that I, of course, had already studied in detail, and tried to make some sense out of it. But this kind of quite chaotic kind of co-production proved to become very, I would say, creative and productive. And so at a certain moment, we started to produce something that we never did before, and obviously nobody else had ever this idea to make it as we did it. And I mean, I don't go into the details. I think most of you know some parts of that work. It was a mapping project. At a certain moment, we decided we start with maps. But don't think that this was just something that was a kind of top-down process. I mean, to show the bottom-up aspect was also what we also did in, I think it was not in the first, but I think it was in the second semester, to get an impression of what's really going on in Switzerland, in urban Switzerland, was that we had a huge map of Switzerland on the wall. And then we had, again, 20 students. For every semester, we had 20 students working on that for about 5 years. And in the total, there were 150 students analyzing Switzerland. And in the second semester, every student got a kind of a dart and had to stand here and throw the dart on the map, and then go there and to that place and come back after 2 weeks and tell us how it looks like, and bring photographs and maps and talk with people, interviews, and it was really fascinating. I have never learned so much on Switzerland like in such a short time in that moment. So it was crazy what kind of results came back, and that was for us a very important source of inspiration and a starting point. So Studio Basel always defined its work as based on the ground, based on concrete research. And we even developed then a kind of a concept, kind of a methodology that we called the method of drill holes. Doesn't work really well in English. In German, it's Bohrungen. That means you make a drill hole into the earth and then you take out what you find. But of course, we didn't go to the underground, but this was the idea that you start somewhere. So somehow the dart that met a certain point, then we said, okay, go to that point. And then, of course, that point is a small point, but then you extend your analysis until you think it's enough. So we hadn't the concept, we hadn't the kind of, we also had, it was forbidden to have limits, okay? So borders were forbidden. So you see it here. Here we showed the border of Switzerland. In most of the cases, we left it away because it was not the point that we analyze Switzerland in its borders or that we accept any kind of existing borders. We analyze the urbanization processes that are shaping this territory. That was the point. And borders we then brought back to the picture. And for instance, at the beginning, all our maps, the rule was that if you bring a map, the border has always been the middle of your map and never at the edge. So it was never kind of it was never the chance that you somehow make a kind of already, let's say, a predetermined kind of decision on the area that you analyze. Okay, and I think what is specific here, and we made, in the meantime, a lot of research, and I think it was in fact the first time that we analyzed the entire territory independently what it is as urbanized. I think it's so that we even here, that was then a long debate what we made with this area, the what we call the Frisch Alpin, and that created a lot of debates, but we also looked at this area as an urbanized area. And what we found out, if we have this look on this territory. Now, that was then continued by other projects. So many, but this one is, I think, is of special interest in that context. It's also from ETH Studio Basel. It's not the entire team, it's a part of this, the half of the team, Project Territory. And for for 6 years they analyzed, let's say, large stripes of territory, like let's say 300 kilometers in one direction and maybe 50 kilometers in the other direction. The first one was actually Rome Adriatic. So they started in Rome and went over the Apennine and came down to the Adriatic and analyzed the whole strip and tried to understand how this territory is changing and which forces are changing this territory. And then they applied that on Belo Horizonte, Muscat and Oman, Red River Delta, so this means Hanoi, Florida, straight through the entire peninsula of Florida, and then also the Nile Valley. Nile Valley, just to give you a very, very short kind of idea about that, as it is, of course, a kind of a linear oasis, and it is somehow seen as a rural area, but in fact, and it is somehow, but if you look in a different way, it is not, because it is heavily kind of relating on Cairo, and it is heavily it is full of internal contradictions, and it is especially the main contradiction is, of course, the territory as such, the scarcity. So you only have the Nile and its valley, and then, I mean, the banks, afterwards is the desert. And this shows kind of desperate trials until now to somehow find an escape route for this kind of let's say, conditions of scarcity that this situation implies. So kind of a parallel linear city along the Nile Valley on the plateau in the desert. Until today not successful, so these are kind of ghost towns today, but these ideas are revived and revived again. Now, the last project I would like to present you is a project that we are just doing now, which is part of the Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore. This is a kind of a research unit that is basically financed by Singapore, but the basic research teams are from ETH Zurich. And it allows certain things, it allows certain projects and research projects that usually are not possible. So you have quite a great range of freedom to do certain things. I do that together. Again, it's a co-production with Milica Topalovic, so she's architect, and she started her, I would say, this kind of approach at ETH Studio Basel. She was for many years researcher at ETH Studio Basel and is now professor at our department. And so I do that project together with her. We have a wonderful cartographer that helps us, Filip Rekačević. I guess some of you know him. He was the cartographer of the Mont Diplomatique for many years. And we have support and advice by Abdulmalik Simone. And we have a wonderful research team. And it's a very short research. It's basically 1 year, but of course based on already ongoing research by the individual researchers. Now here the question is, so what does it mean, extended urbanization? So how can we grasp it? How can we understand it? What is that? So if we look on the dimensions of analysis, so we have to look on the production of the urban fabric or the urban tissue, in the sense of it's not only the fabric, but it's like a tissue that is somehow developing on the territory. We have to analyze, and that became more and more clear for us, we have to analyze movements and connections, and not only build form. We have to analyze scales of interaction, because these scales might extend over huge distances. We have to analyze territorial regulation and state strategies, and of course, the transformation of everyday life. And I don't know how much time is left. Maybe I just give you some ideas what we are doing. Okay. So one is production of new scales of urbanization. So that's the Pearl River Delta, only half of it. Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dongguan, and this was part of research we did before. And now we look at this area again. So and this has become the largest urban territory on Earth. Nobody knows how many people live in this area because you don't have any borders. You don't know how to limit that area. Numbers of something between 80 and 120 million. But I mean, somehow it doesn't make sense to count people here. The point is just that the urbanization process has really become very different dimensions, and that's just one picture from Shenzhen, from the industrial zone. This is relatively close to the place where all these laptops and smartphones and so on are produced by Foxconn. And that picture is about 5 years old, and today it looks totally different. So that's really fast urbanization. Then another aspect is the emergence of complex and multi-scalar center-periphery relationships. And here we analyze the West African corridor between Lagos and Abidjan. Is a research that Alice Herzog does. She actually is she positioned herself here, Cotonou. And you see a kind of linear structure that is establishing along the coastline, and that's the new kind of coastal motorway that is produced here. It is a kind of a bypass. On the ground, it looks like that. So it goes directly through the settlements, and this used to be quite nice beaches and quite a nice beach life, and now you have the motorway that goes straight through it. And if you continue that line, you find also places like that. That's already in Togo. And so these are some kids, and they sell sand. I mean, that's at the beach. So here is the sea. So that's the beach. And that's that sand from the beach that you can buy for construction. So that also shows the kind of dimensions that this kind of extended urbanization can take. And so here it's, of course, an analysis that looks much more on this kind of movements and connections. And here, I mean, this famous term that Abdelmarik Simon brought up, people as infrastructure, that is a key element here. Then, of course, you have the blurring and rearticulation of the urban fabric. That is something we studied in Singapore. And that was really a kind of dramatic experience. Singapore as an island with 5 million people. And then you think, wow, yes, this is perfectly organized and everything, quite authoritarian, but that's another story. And then you leave that country, and then suddenly you are in a kind of zone that you don't understand anymore. So this is a photograph from a kampung, an old village. You see in the horizon, you see the skyline of Singapore. And if you are in this village, you have the impression you are far away. This is a totally different world. And that's not Singapore anymore, this is Indonesia. And if you look on that now from the airplane, then you see here, so this is the kampung here on the top. And then you see something like this, which is a fantasy island, which is a kind of holiday weekend resort for the people in Singapore. And what you don't see is if you continue here, you find one of the biggest shipyards of this world that just goes down for about 20 kilometers. What you see, if you continue your flight, you see all sorts of construction sites, and this is just one for a theme park, but it could also be a construction site for a new factory or for anything. So here you are somehow in the battlefield of urbanization, where all different kinds of things are kind of constructed, and where you don't understand what's really going on. And so all this kind of hype about the mega cities and the global cities and all these kind of ideas about sustainable urban development become a caricature if you look, okay, then you have Singapore, and you can maybe discuss about kind of futures that are somehow sustainable, but then you leave Singapore and then you think that will be never sustainable, never ever, impossible. It's just so, let's say, it's like the Wild West, but that's the Wild West with huge investments, and that will never ever bring any kind of useful spatial structure, or that we could even in the far future call sustainable. That is completely unsustainable, these kind of developments. That goes on with a similar process of implosion, explosion of urban regions. This is also from an earlier project where we analyze bypass urbanism, so new urban centralities that somehow bypass the old city. That's the example of Kolkata, especially on the right-hand side. That's almost a completely new city that is constructed in Lagos. So this is the old city that you know maybe from certain photographs. And then there is a complete new city that is constructed here and somehow leaves behind the 18 million people living on the mainland. That's a similar process in Mexico City. This is Santa Fe that has a huge effect on reconfiguring the entire urban region. Another point is the operationalization of landscapes, and that has many, many aspects. Okay, I will just stop with that then. So this is in Iowa, a project that Nikos Katsikis makes, and if that works, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. I don't know why it doesn't work. Okay, it's a pity. It's a film, and it shows you this structure of this kind of agricultural areas in Iowa that produce basically corn and soya beans, and where you would say nature is somehow replaced. So everything that you use to produce this is fully automated, and everything that you produce, you have to somehow invest. So the natural fertility of the soil is gone. So you can't grow anything without fertilizers, without a massive input of energy. Now I could continue with similar processes in the palm oil production, with global mining. That's in the Atacama Desert. A wonderful, well, the example is horrible, but a wonderful piece by Martin Arboleda. That's a demonstration of workers, of mining workers in Carajás, in the midst of the Brazilian Amazon, and that's the biggest mine on earth. And they needed 20,000 people to construct the mine, so they constructed a city. And now the mine is constructed, and now the mine employs less than 100 people, and so you understand that here, and what happens with the people, what happens with the city. Now I could continue about the urbanization of the sea, or the urbanization of the Arctic, I mean, that goes on with logistics, and ends with the peripheralization of territories. That was our famous Frisch Alpine that we looked at, and in our project now we look on a place that has similar tendencies but is more extreme in that case, Arcadia, a place where you still see the villages, but almost nobody lives anymore in these villages. But nevertheless, these territories are used in one way or another, but we have to completely change our perspective if you want to analyze these areas. But what has become clear is that, let's say, the perspective that these are rural areas are not helpful to understand anything that's going on in these territories. And now I've come to the end. So what could be so-called sustainable urban futures? And do we need, and we guess we need a new urban agenda. We can't work with the with the current urban agenda, because they don't look on these processes of extended urbanization. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.